sort of an example of why the intersectionalities in housing, you know, we know about like some people who are at this meeting that provide case management services and help people do that nitty gritty work of applying for assistance, but don't work in the world of figuring out how to pay for projects, other affordable housing and those sort of gaps, and or work with the legal system about how to protect people with their rights to what applies and what doesn't. And what I found most commonly is that whatever people assume the law is about housing in Kentucky is usually not it, because it is it makes absolutely no sense what is real. And then we can't ignore is that when you're talking about housing, you're always talking about people that have exacerbated need, almost always. And of course, all basic community policies should be designed inclusively, but when you're talking about things for housing, you're dealing more often than not and more likely than in other scenarios with people who have additional challenges. Need extra support. So the point is that people are extra vulnerable when it comes to housing. And then now to why I said most of Kentucky doesn't have landlord-tenant law, because it doesn't. So this word ULTA, the Uniform Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, when that is used in this presentation, it's referring to ULTA 1, the original, which we're going to go back and forth here for just a second, which is from 1972. Anybody want to do a quick math in the chat about how long ago that was? I will tell you that the Uniform Law Commission that writes laws like this, they generally, once a generation, reconsider issues and areas of law that need to have a uniform law across the country, right? That makes sense. Obviously, no one took me up on my math challenge of how to figure out how old ULTA 1 is. So it's ULTA 1 is what some people call it. It's the original ULTA. I just have it ULTA in this presentation because it's the only piece of it, thank you, Rachel, or one of the people named Rachel, that has been adopted in Kentucky. And it is only in the counties in green, only the dots in green, where there is a basic habitability standard for housing under state law. That is one of the big takeaways from this. Kentucky does not require generally housing to be habitable, which matters when it comes to recovery housing, which matters when it comes to all kinds of housing. Now there are, of course, people are thinking, what? I provide services and we are definitely have habitable housing, and most do. But the problem is when people don't or something falls apart, home renters assume that they can force the landlord to fix it, even when it's in a sober living house, and you cannot. The law does not protect for that. So that is just sort of not trying to hide the ball. That's one of the big takeaways from this presentation. Only local building codes apply, and the majority of Kentucky has very few or no building codes. And of course, there are waivers for grandmother and grandfather in buildings that existed before codes existed. It really leaves for more loophole than law. So if you'll notice, this is like 4% of the ground in Kentucky. Now, it does cover quite a bit of Kentucky population because Louisville here and Lexington here. And then the few little dots up here, including like Covington, where I am right now. But, you know, most of Kentucky is without a reliable floor for how housing should be dealt with under the law. So right now, again, there has been in 2015, I'll put that into the chat. In 2015, there was an update to ULTA, which some people call ULTA 2. Kentucky has never considered that or looked at it. We are still looking at the OG original ULTA, which we still only have in, again, the 4 counties and 15 cities, including there's some serious notable areas without ULTA, including our state capital and including some of the largest cities in Kentucky. Kentucky only has 2 cities over 100,000, which when this law was first passed, were singled out as first-class cities, which is why there was a lawsuit, Miles versus Shawnee decision in 1983, which found ULTA unconstitutional because you can't have something about cities with first class only, and very specifically, no implied warranty of habitability exists under Kentucky law. That is incredibly important, especially when you're talking about people with additional vulnerabilities or people who are least likely to have tools available to them to advocate for themselves when they are not being treated justly in their housing, specifically people who have substance use disorders or are newly in recovery and or have mental health diagnoses that they're working through. Just, if you're feeling a little bit of anger coming through, that is how I feel about it. It's hard not to feel that way. So, and then just a real quick, ULTA is a floor. Ohio, our neighbors, everyone except for Arkansas has something this or better. So it's a very basic floor. And again, it's just Kentucky and Arkansas that don't have habitability. Tennessee has just a few little spots in a few counties that are excluded, but generally everybody else has that. And it's just very basic stuff, things you would expect. That landlords are required to maintain the property. You have to give notice before entering. And if they want to do something other than that, they have to give notice that they're going to change the lease to do that. And you can't evict the tenant in retaliation, reporting a housing problem, which is something that comes up often in sober living houses and recovery houses. So, long-standing rule in Kentucky: a tenant, a homeowner, takes the premises as they find them. The landlord need not exercise, I'm sorry I'm reading to you, but I want to make sure that everybody hears this, need not exercise even ordinary care to furnish reasonably safe premises. That's, again, if that's the only thing you remember from this, then it is still, I think, worth all of our time and understanding that this has to change in Kentucky for us to be able to move forward and be fair to each other. And this is just an example of what things can look like and literally have looked like in specific. Yes, whichever Rachel McKinney that is, the PowerPoint will be sent out for sure. That's why there's all these words in here. I'm not a huge fan of lots of words in PowerPoints except as reference material, and so a lot of this is here for reference material. Just basic, and this says best industry practices. The floor is the floor, and again, that most Kentucky programs that are good wouldn't have to change anything at all. It's just what people call bad apples. Although, friendly reminder that one bad apple does spoil the whole bunch because it causes all the other apples to go bad. Lots of people in Kentucky have been for years, I've been for a solid decade, working to get some housing law in Kentucky. The closest we got was it passed the House once, has not been heard in the Senate in 40 years. And then why does this matter for recovery housing? Since I know a lot of you signed up with that in the title, because recovery housing is rental housing. And a lot of Kentucky, so the majority of Kentucky rental housing is in a public accommodation where the ADA does apply. However, especially in Northern Kentucky, with a lot of people that I have represented in the past, are in strictly residential private homes for which the ADA does not cover that, right? But if it is a place of a public accommodation, it does apply. And in common spaces, even in strictly residential private apartments or homes, common spaces, the ADA does also still apply. But I just want to make sure that people are aware that a lot of people think, oh, well, the ADA would cover that. It doesn't always. It isn't always how it works. And it's also not that easy to enforce. So, and then what are we talking about with recovery? This is directly from NARS, Primer on Recovery Residences. And again, this is just a reference place so that you've got this in there to know that that's what we're talking about. I hope that most folks on here know about what we're talking about. And again, looking at the participant list, I see people who work in recovery residences. So that makes it seem like you all probably, again, know more than I do. But it's a place where people are living. And the people are living with supportive and clinical services aimed at promoting long-term recovery. But the fact that people are living there is why we're talking about that they're also rental properties. They're also have the rights of homeowners included. So what's going on in Kentucky? Yeah.
Before you go on, you do have a question.
Yeah.
What makes something a place of public accommodation?
So that is a legal term of art, and there's not generally a business, if it's open for business, although if that business is exclusively private residential, then it is not included. So, but if you are offering clinical services, then you're going to be public accommodation. That is a very case-by-case analysis, to be honest. So, but generally, like a doctor's office that's in a private residence, well, that's inviting people into that business, which creates a different sort of, it's tied to the tort value, which I don't know that we necessarily need to go into if you're a licensee or an invitee. But if you are open to the public, inviting people in, you are definitely public accommodation. But a lot of our recovery residences, especially the ones that don't offer clinical services, don't fall under that.
So,
so sorry, that's not the easiest answer in the world.
So for clarification, even though people are invited through a tenant landlord contract or agreement into a recovery house, they are not considered a place of public accommodation. Is that correct?
That's correct. That is, generally it's about the public at large. So there's non-discrimination in public accommodations if you are using it by the public at large. But the thing is that with a lot of those, private clubs are exempt, religious organizations are exempt. There's lots of exemptions if it's not open to the public generally. So you can have and I'm not an ADA lawyer. I have tried unsuccessfully to use the ADA to protect people in Kentucky from sober living houses where their rights were not being protected, and I believe that they were being discriminated against, and was unsuccessful based on being ruled that it was not a public accommodation and that the ADA did not apply. Although public accommodation is broad, so there's always room. I don't want to discourage anyone. If you're here thinking, I want to make the argument that this is a public accommodation, do it. Make that argument and make the argument about discrimination to use to protect people, because I don't think you're not hurting anyone if it is by trying that. I just don't want people to rely on it and think that for sure this means that people who live in this place are going to have those protections. Does that make sense? It's so weird to, talk into these things where it's just talking into the void, and I'm not sure if any of that makes sense or not. What's going on? Let me know in the chat. Thanks. So what's going on in Kentucky right now is big changes with recovery housing. NAR certification. Kentucky just became a NAR affiliate weeks ago, April 1st, 2021. So brand new. And what does that mean, of course? That it's very evolving and that there's an incremental rollout. We already started with the core, the Kentucky Opioid Response Effort, and we've also already had 8 recovery operators applied for and received the Medication for Opioid Use Disorder Bed Expansion Grant. And those all then included NAR certification. So all 8 of those have NAR certification. But this is a slow, it's not, I don't know if it's slow, but this is just currently new and rolling out right now in Kentucky. I just put in there just so y'all know that the first was the Serenity Apartments at Crystal's house, and that there's no like punishment involved with NAR certification. It is the carrot approach that you are eligible for grants that you would not be eligible for otherwise, but there is no requirement to get NAR certification, and there is no sort of regulatory piece in place. However, it is, I think, a big deal that Kentucky, let's see, why is that changing? Kentucky is the first state, I'm not sure where it is. Oh yeah, the first state and the only state that has a state government affiliate. So we have created in Kentucky, the Kentucky Recovery Housing Network, which is a state government program within DBH, the Department for Behavioral Health. The link is here. If you have that, you'll have that link. And then also Jonathan Philpott. I'm sure a lot of people on this call are familiar with Jonathan Philpott. He is the program director for the Kentucky Recovery Housing Network, which is, again, the only one in the country where we're doing it through the state government. And the plan is to have it moved out of state government, but right now that's where we are, and that's how it's working in Kentucky. So, and then I had some questions in advance about funding and partnerships, and most are joint efforts. There's lots of, and then I'm not the best person to speak to development plans. I don't understand them, but I know that Adrienne Bush from HHCK is on here, so you can send questions her way about funding affordable housing and how some of those different partnerships work, and some of the academy that HHCK offers to make sure that you're connecting people with different skill sets in that realm to create the affordable housing that people need. So, and then back to what happens when things go wrong, because that's what people need to know about, what they worry about. And so we got one takeaway from this so far is Kentucky does not have habitability. You do not have a right to a place to be able to be lived in. That's a big takeaway. Next one, you can only be evicted by a judge in court. So those are your two big ones. You can only be evicted by a judge in court. And what normally happens is something happens before a notice, and usually it's non-payment or a material breach of the lease, damage to the property, or a termination of month-to-month. And now I wanted to toss in here, anything I say from this point forward basically doesn't apply to Louisville. So Jefferson County has had a tremendous number of changes to the way that they are handling evictions in the last few months. They are very specific to Louisville, so we yet even have more disparity in Kentucky for what it means to be a home renter, what it means to be responsible for a home where people live. That means very different things depending on what your address is. And it can even, if you remember all the way back to that early map, it can even be different in the same county, in front of the same judge, in the same courtroom, depending on which side of the street you're on. You have to look to that exact address to see if it is in the city limits or not, or within a city that has adopted a law or not, which is not a great way to do business. It's very inefficient for the courts. It's inefficient for people that are sitting there, and it's very confusing to everyone involved that a different law applies, even though you are in the same jurisdiction, the same county, the same district court, the same judge, the same courtroom. Very confusing. But whenever something happens, then you get a notice of that, and then there's a hearing, and then there's either enforcement of that judgment or an appeal of that judgment. But again, you can only be evicted by a judge in court. So no habitability, and only be evicted by a judge in court.
So Cara, I have a question for you with regard to that.
Yep.
Particularly with respect to the termination of month-to-month tenancy. Some of our recovery houses, we have some that do
week to week,
month, they do week by week, and they may do longer periods of time. But I think it's important to note there that tenancy at will or at sufferance with 1 month's written notice, how does that fall into the practice of somebody returning to a recovery house in a state of impairment, and that recovery house wanting to ask that individual or require that individual to leave immediately? How does that affect that piece of statute?
So leaving immediately is not an eviction. Leaving immediately can only happen for criminality or a danger to themselves or others. You cannot evict someone immediately, because you can only be evicted if you have a tenancy established. Even if you are a tenancy at sufferance, you can only be evicted by a judge in court. So that can't be immediate. There has to be a notice, and a notice has to run. Now that notice has been found by courts in Kentucky that 3 days is sufficient notice. So that's been upheld in non-ULTA jurisdictions. So in the majority of Kentucky, and I'm sure it's probably, I don't know of a case where it's been less than that, but I would be shocked if there have not been judges who've accepted notice in even less than 3 days. But yeah, it gets complicated where recovery houses, and I have, Sonia, represented people where that happened to them, where they became homeless instantly, which the recovery house argued that they were not a tenant, and I believe that they were. And again, it depends how that case is going to turn out. It's going to depend on where you are in Kentucky, unfortunately. So even if you are,
I'm sorry.
So they'll say we don't have a tenancy. There is, and then you look at the facts of, do they have a toothbrush there? How many nights have they stayed there? Was there an expectation that they would continue to be there? Was it a day-to-day arrangement? Because a day-to-day requires 1 day notice. Like that's, but generally when that happens, it's because their recovery house is alleging that they don't have a tenancy established. I generally say that is not acceptable, because oftentimes that is where the person lives and where they expect to live, and therefore they should have the rights of a tenant, which is if that sober living house or that recovery residence has been approved by NAR, would have that in writing and would have a grievance policy in writing and would be required to address those issues. But right now, that is not like legally required out there. So it's perfectly lawful most of the time, and they're able to get away with it. It also requires, an affirmative lawsuit by that possible tenant, which is a big, heavy lift. So it's much easier to have a policy in place saying that sober living houses, recovery houses have to have different policies in place to prevent things like that, and have to have relationships for additional housing to make sure that doesn't happen, than in trying to individually, one by one, represent individual people who are interacting with those bad apples. Which is why we need very basic landlord-tenant law everywhere in Kentucky.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. It's as we learn, myself and the opioid team learn more about the recovery housing landscape in Kentucky, I think that we find that everybody has challenges, and we've got to figure out how to support recovery houses and protect the consumer at the same time.
Yeah, and it's not a super simple, obvious answer, but I do think that the NAR standards do have a good starting place. So I think if you add in ULTA too, preferably, plus some other protections, and then the NAR standards for requiring the policies and procedures be laid out in advance for any sober living house or any recovery residence, then I think you don't run into that. I think you've got things in place, but none of that exists in Kentucky right now. There's just this teeny tiny trickle of NAR certification, very voluntary, and those have been by the larger participants. So, and again, that notice, for when you do go to court to be evicted by a judge, there are not many protections for how that notice happens. That courts have found that just posting it to a door, even if they know you're not there or haven't been there, not going to come home, or you're in jail, that is sufficient, which in the majority of Kentucky, which I don't think is sufficient. And I think most reasonable people would think somebody should have to know to defend themselves. And again, like you were saying why did that change? With month to month, replace that word with day to day or week to week, because if it is week to week and someone is terminating your week to week tenancy, then they need to give, and it's a non-ULTA, they need to give you a week. If you pay your rent 3 times a week, then it is 1/3 of a week. It depends on how you pay your rent as to how long you have to get notice in a non-ULTA. In ULTA, it is based on the lease and or 7 days for non-payment with a right to cure. Big deal. If you're in the majority of the state, if you are late with your rent, landlord says I'm evicting you, and you say, but I've got it, here it is. If it's a day late, they don't have to take it, they can still terminate you. Same thing with recovery houses. If you say, but I am in compliance now, you have no right to remedy that. If you're in a ULTA jurisdiction, which I have had a case like this, where it was about a use non-compliance, and I said they have remedied. So you cannot evict them because they have remedied that violation. And ULTA says that they have a right to remedy that once every 6 months. So, and that worked in that case. But again, that only applies in 15 municipalities and 4 counties in Kentucky. But you do have in those jurisdictions a stronger argument to say remedy. You have the right to remedy a material breach. And if being under the influence is a material breach, and a court were to find that that was a material breach, you would still have the right to remedy in one of those jurisdictions, but not in the majority of Kentucky. So just sort of more to what you were asking about earlier, Sonia. And that's sort of the same thing here. very frustrating. Then acceptance of rent. You know, a lot of suburban houses have market rent. And something that's very important to think about is acceptance of rent prevents a operator or a landlord from continuing with a termination because it acts as a waiver of that termination. So a new notice has to be given, something else has to happen. And that's just that's an important thing for providers to think about and remember because they get very upset when it's like, well, but I only took partial rent and they owed me this much. Well, you've still waived your right to terminate. And it's important for the home renters, even in recovery residences, to be aware that that is an option for them. And if the landlord accepts it, that gives them new protections. This is sort of the nitty gritty of at the hearing, like, is there a relationship, which in a lot of recovery residences, is there a landlord-tenant relationship is the bulk of the hearing. And then, of course, is there a material breach, and what makes it material? Was proper notice given, and are they still in possession? Because if somebody moves out before court, they're not guilty. They can't possibly be guilty of forcibly detaining a property because they're not detaining it. So that's one of the kind of ultimate outs for preventing an eviction on someone's record. Just tell them if they don't have any other defenses, and it is possible for them to move before court. If they do that, then they're not going to be found guilty, and that won't be on their record. And again, big takeaway, no implied warranty of habitability in Kentucky. People do have a right to appeal. The appeal is governed by our Kentucky civil rules. And it is, to stay the execution of the judgment, you do have to, if there's a non-payment issue, there has to be a bond paid, and courts vary in their enforcement of that bond. And I think that if you have informa pauperis and are unable to pay the bond, that you should be able to stay the execution of the judgment pending appeal. And there are some clerks and some courts that agree and some that do not. And again, that varies widely.
Cara, just a question about habitability. I see that there's no implied habitability at the state level, but how does that work with the local health departments and the standards for health departments for housing? So if there's no electricity, or are there health code violations that would help support habitability?
No. The short answer, no. So there are, most of that stops on the outside of the house. So if your local health department, if you report to the local health department, and that depends county to county as to what their jurisdiction is with that. That is not, the Division of Building Code Enforcement is not through the health department in Northern Kentucky, and there is nothing unlawful in Kentucky about not having water or electric or access to it in a home.
What about sewage?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I mean, it's horrifying to think about. So there are some localities that have property maintenance, nuisance, and zoning codes. And so things can apply there, but those are few and far in between in Kentucky. There are property maintenance codes in some cities. There are sanitation codes in some cities that may impact environmental health issues. But again, those are few and far between. And then there are some specific things like what's called like straight pipes for sewage. Some counties have outlawed that. And then there is a lax enforcement of straight pipes, especially in Eastern Kentucky. But there is no workaround of call the health department. And then if you do, what often is, so if you're in Covington where I am, where we do have code enforcement and you can report a place that doesn't have access to utilities, well, that's also your ULTA, but let's imagine it wasn't your ULTA. You could call code enforcement. That isn't going to force the landlord to fix it. That just means you're now homeless because you're going to get an immediate notice you have to be out because it is danger under that code enforcement rule. So I have had clients who have done that and then were out on the street that same day. So it's not necessarily helpful to them. So what would be helpful is being able to, hey, I'm still paying you generally market rent. You should have to keep this place able to be lived in. Because people typically don't move into places that don't have a toilet or don't have access to sewage. What happens is somebody's lived somewhere for a long time and it falls down around them. And the landlord doesn't fix it and doesn't have a legal, you can't force them to fix it. So that's what generally happens. And I know this may sound like really extreme, but I have seen it happen. I have seen a house with sewage on the inside in Fort Thomas in Kentucky, and the judge did not rule that that they still had to pay market rent, and that they could still be evicted for withholding any portion of the rent to buy a wet vac to try to soak up the sewage that was in their living room floor.
Wow. I know this is, for recovery housing advocates, but I'm thinking also about how we protect the consumer in these situations because we want everybody to succeed. Does the landlord have to disclose that information prior to somebody signing a rental agreement?
No,
Okay.
no.
It's
as you find it.
So my biggest takeaway that I'm hearing right now, so tell me if I'm wrong, is that right now, Kentucky law is very pro-landlord, and there is little protection for the consumer.
Yes. Well, there's very little law. That's the problem, Sonia. It's not that the law is pro-landlord so much as there is a vacuum of law, which when you're falling back on common law, yes. I would say then it feels very provider or landlord friendly in the majority of the state. Now that's not true in some specific localities, but specific localities are different. But yeah, so it's not that the laws are that friendly, it's that there's a lack of law. We don't have it. It doesn't exist. All we have is that Supreme Court decision that says there is expressly no warrant of habitability in Kentucky. Which, yeah, I would love for that to no longer be true, but that is what I hope everyone focuses on, that should not be true. And then the other thing is how fast this all happens. In Kenton County, where I used to go to court every single week and where I still check the docket pretty regularly to keep up with what's going on, you have around 100 families a week who are evicted in 45 minutes. It's rare for a hearing to last 60 seconds. So like that, people believe that there is sort of a day in court or that they will be heard by the judge. And evictions in Kentucky are a summary proceeding, which means you cannot do discovery, which means there's a lot of restrictions on what you're able to do, even if you are represented. So they're very quick summary proceedings, and they shouldn't be, because people should have a right to housing, and people should have a right to be heard if they're facing a loss of their housing. And I personally believe that people should have a right to counsel if they're facing a loss of their housing. That is not the case in most places in the country, but I think that people have a right to housing and therefore have a right to the same way that you are entitled to an attorney if you can't afford one, if you're facing a loss of your freedom. I think if you're facing a loss of your children or a loss of your home, that same right should be afforded. It is not, be very clear, it is not. That is just Cara Stewart thinks it should be. And I think that there is a little bit of movement energy around that. I don't want to say in thanks to COVID, but the spotlight has been brightened on how terrible and quick that can be without any sort of, without anybody knowing what's going on. And then this is a matching slide. So if my landlord won't fix anything, I can put my rent in escrow. Escrow in Kentucky is just as real as that unicorn. So there is no such thing as escrow in Kentucky, although most people think there is. I would love if the Interactive Health wanted to include some of that in their polling, to asking people, because I have had people in public forums argue up and down, and elected officials argue that there is escrow, but I assure you, as an attorney who has practiced a lot of housing cases and published in housing law, there is no such thing except for on appeal. But there is no such thing as putting your rent in escrow. to protect against eviction in Kentucky. But if you Google it, you will find that there is. It's sort of like if anybody been Googling this during this presentation, because if you Google it, you'll think that I am a big fat liar, because you'll come up with all of this law, because ULTA comes up. If you look Kentucky landlord tenant laws, ULTA comes up. And unless you open that one section that says this only applies if it was adopted in this way by that local government, then you don't know that all that law you just found doesn't actually apply. But you'll think it does because you found it, you know? So another myth, please, no habitability, no escrow. These are our takeaways, right? I didn't get a real eviction notice, just something my landlord typed up. That is a real eviction notice. Eviction notices can be with crayon on a receipt. That is a real eviction notice. So there is no legal requirement for it to be typed. There's nothing for it to have any color of ink or any kind of signature. And that is a danger for a lot of home renters in Kentucky, because they believe that they do not have to take something as seriously because they believe that it was not real because it was just, whatever it was. And same thing for providers. Like, it can just be a piece of paper where you put the when and the why and give it to somebody. That counts. I just included some of these that I've heard a bazillion times in my life, that you can be evicted if you're disabled. You can be evicted if you're disabled and on Christmas Day, and if it's 0 degrees outside, you can be evicted. None of those are defenses. And the judge actually finds you guilty or not guilty that day in court. So there's a lot of misinformation out there that judges give you 7 days in Kentucky if you are evicted. That is fiercely untrue. Judges find you guilty or not guilty of forcible detainer right then and there in that moment, and if you were guilty, you are evicted in that moment. You have 7 days in which to appeal that judgment. So that appeal period, the landlord, the owner, the operator, they can't execute that judgment until the appeal period is run. So they can't go get a writ of execution until that appeal period has run, so which makes it seem like the judge gave you 7 days. But the reality is you were found guilty or not guilty and evicted that day. I hope that makes sense. It's like a distinction without a difference, but for some reason it matters a lot to me, because I think it's because if people think the judge gave them 7 days, they think the judge can give them more days, but the judge isn't giving anyone any days. That's not what's happening. And so I think that's where it becomes a risk to me, and why I feel strongly that people need to know there is no days. They're just not giving you any days. It's in that moment. It's the appeal period. People don't have to take anything except exactly what is due to them, and the operator or landlord can determine if it was a proper remedy. If they're going to accept the remedy, it's completely at their discretion. And by court day, nobody has to take nothing. Sometimes people will, sometimes people won't. And some even if it's extra. So, and then there is my contact information. I'm going to go back to our map and see if anybody wants to plunder through any more of this or talk about any of it.
Yeah, thank you, Cara. I was going to open it up for some questions, comments in the chat box now. We greatly appreciate your time, and we all understand how challenging it is to understand how to be a good landlord in Kentucky and what the expectations and requirements are. So we certainly want to have any questions. And I forgot to add at the beginning, but I do want to say this now. This webinar applies only to those in the state of Kentucky. Indiana and Ohio have different laws governing recovery housing, including landlord tenant laws. So just if you're from outside of Kentucky, just be mindful that this does not apply to you.
Also unmute yourself. That's fine too. I think everybody has the ability to do that. In fact, I'll even stop sharing so that we can see each other, or more of us see each other.
I would love to know how many individuals on this webinar are current recovery housing operators. So if you'd put that in the chat box, we greatly appreciate that. And any challenges that you've been experiencing. Thank you, Erin and Rachel.
Oh, Lisa, do we anticipate implementation? Rationally, no, but am I hopeful? Yes. And Brighton Center, you are awesome and are not a place that anybody ever complains about with a lot of these issues. So, Rachel, none of this was directed at you. I just saw that in there. And Erin, I don't know who you're with, which one, but I assume that the folks that caused a lot of the problems for the things that I'm talking about wouldn't actually come to this webinar, but maybe. Lisa, there is a lot of grassroots advocacy pushing and battling. Okay, so all the rules right now are very different in Louisville. Louisville just changed a lot of their processes very specifically. But again, that sort of goes to what I think is a problem of it depending on where you are, what street you're on, as to what rules apply to you, it should be the same. There is grassroots movement, a lot of it, more than there has been in years past, to push for statewide landlord-tenant laws and home renter laws in Kentucky. And there is hopefully going to be some more organized advocacy around that soon. And I think that it is not, I'm hopeful that it can happen. It's also just, it's just us in Arkansas, y'all. Like, what? Guam and Puerto Rico have a right to habitability and Kentucky doesn't. Like, we should be able to get that together, right? Like, I don't think I'm suggesting anything crazy. Sort of a low bar. And also, it's been working fine. We could ask Erin how it's working in Louisville, but, it's been there for 30 years and nobody's repealed it. We've had 30 years of ULTA in Fayette County, in Jefferson County, in Oldham County, in Pulaski County, and no one who has ever adopted it has repealed it. So I think that's also a good option. Yeah, and I think, a lot of operators are working in Kentucky, Anita just said this, working towards becoming NAR certified. And NAR certification is a much higher bar than habitability and basic stuff. It is like way up there, gold standard. So like what I'm advocating for being the law is not NAR certification. It is a basic floor of knowing that there's protections in place and that everyone has the same law that applies to them. But yeah, I think it's going to be great as we get more and more NAR certified recovery residences in Kentucky that we can refer people to and have better experiences and better outcomes for our neighbors. Like that seems like the way to go. I just, of course, lawyers always look for the what if worst and like, your finger gets cut off because of the power button in your car kind of scenario. There will still be operators that exploit the fact that there is no basic floor for landlord-tenant law. And unfortunately, people who I know will face that exploitation will be people with substance use disorders and will be people with mental health diagnoses, because I have represented them. And I know there's just no reality without regulation, that won't happen.
We have another question in the
chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate Lisa Myers for keeping the conversation going. My guess is that she had lunch before this, and so she's feeling flexible in that way. The care versus stick approach is that no one gets shut down for not being NAR certified. All you do is become eligible for different funding streams. You become eligible for different referral streams. You become eligible for references and for inclusion in different other programs, from court programs to joint programs with other agencies. So that's the benefit, and people finding you and knowing that you're legit. And so when family members are out looking, they can feel confident that this is a place that they want their loved one to be, because they know that it is a good program. And again, we've got lots of great programs in Kentucky that are not currently NAR certified. So I don't want it to seem like only NAR certified are the good ones. There are fantastic recovery residences doing amazing work, saving people's lives in Kentucky that do not have that certification. That's just one very clear line in the sand to know that this is a solid place to be. And it does come with, like bathroom counts and square inches and square feet, things that are hard to do. So even if you've got all the programmatic elements, your physical building may not meet some of the NAR certification requirements. And that's when I would say work with Jonathan and Phillips at the Department for Behavioral Health and figure out what can be done, and without, like, you know, spending money you don't have to spend, because it's a very sort of personalized and unique process. Based on, I go to most of those calls and have talked to Jonathan Phillips about this. So I think that's the approach in Kentucky right now, is to lean on that resource to work through it. And also my head just immediately goes to all the ugliest, most awful things, like that sewage case. I've had multiple sewage cases. One with, you know, one in Boone County where I got to this person's house and there was like there's a hole in the wall beside their door and animals living in their house, and they were paying more rent than I was paying for this trailer in Boone County. But he was a disabled veteran who didn't have a car and had no way to move or leave, and he was able to afford that rent. But affording that rent for a place that didn't have indoor plumbing and had animals and literal holes in the wall and like an open fire for his heat source, you know, but, and I took that case and tried to do a judicial challenge without the law, just to try to apply it to the court for equity. And unfortunately, he died from, I think, at least in part, some of the conditions in which he was living before the court was able to rule. And so it was mooted. He didn't have an estate to keep going with it. So that's the kind of stuff that's out there. I feel like I'm fear mongering a little bit, but the reality is we have not enough housing in Kentucky, period. It is not great quality overall. You know, if you compare like the quality of our housing, because we're a poor state, it is abysmally unaffordable across the state. We have not nearly enough rental housing, and there's no requirements for it to be able to be lived in. So with all of those pressures at work, you're not likely to have the market turn out a higher quality product for those with the least power. Just, you know, keeping that all in perspective. Yeah, Aaron, I just suddenly got real nervous that maybe that was some of the places that were here, but yeah, recovering housing residences, generally cases there, they were usually about behavior. So it was usually about, and if they were in a ULTA jurisdiction, if I'm representing that renter, I was representing that they were a tenant and they had a right to remedy, so that even if that place had a kind of a one strike you're out policy, that they couldn't legally have a one strike you're out policy if you were in a ULTA jurisdiction, like where you are, Aaron, in Louisville, or in Covington, where I had some cases, you can't make that argument if you're in a different jurisdiction, unfortunately. So that's one of the ways in which landlord-tenant law intersects with recovery housing residents, where there is that right that even if you're in a ULTA jurisdiction and you have someone sign a program code that says you use and you're out, you're then fighting, does that contract, which one has superiority and which one sort of trumps the other one, because there is the inherent existing ULTA law, which says they have the right to remedy. And I think that ULTA would preempt that contract. Of course, I'm making that argument on behalf of, I'm always representing the resident. I would make the opposite argument if I was representing a recovery house, that they have a subsequent contract in addition to their lease. And if I were running a recovery house, I would have people sign those after I had them sign their lease, so that in time it came after. But it's because it's not the most clear-cut thing, and it would depend on the judge in negotiation in that matter. And I think that in Jefferson County, everybody is getting an opportunity for mediation, which is fantastic, and there should be mediation in all housing cases, except when there's harassment or violence included, which also ends up happening between landlords and tenants, unfortunately, and other legal things. I was trying to think of just sort of a fun, juicy case, but I don't know if that's really actually helpful use of people's time.
While you're thinking about that, Cara, one question I have is, if I am not currently an operator in Kentucky, but I am considering finding a location and opening a recovery house, what kind of advice would you give? And I'm thinking about any zoning issues when I start to lease out my house, some of the NIMBY challenges that we might face. What are your recommendations?
To start with a broader coalition of stakeholders immediately. Bring in people who have done that work nearby, go through the HHCK Academy to work on that, and make sure that you've got more stakeholders in between. Oh, I don't know about the difference, the Fletcher Group and the NAR certification. I know I have learned about NAR and I know about that, and I am not qualified to talk about the differences, Colin. I apologize. And I will also say that right now there's a lot of opportunity too for some other funds. Like right now, Recovery Kentucky gets some Section 8 money. Section 8 is the Housing Choice Voucher Program. It's a federal funding program for supporting people with low income for housing. And if you have any tenants that you're trying to get into stable long-term housing outside of recovery residences, you want them to have the Housing Choice Voucher because that follows the person, not the place. That is what I call the golden ticket. That voucher can stay with you the rest of your life, even if your income goes up above where you're able to use it. It'll just go to zero, and it's very supportive for people. But right now, there is Section 8 money that is going to Recovery Kentucky for beds that are not being used, and I'm appreciative of Recovery Kentucky having a great program and making sure that they're keeping, you never know about the flux. This is a tricky piece and part of it where there's a lot of flux in traffic and knowing what you need to have available in terms of staffing. We have the same issue with our incarceration system where we continue to have, some people would argue, and I would be one of them, that we create the demand, if we say we have to keep all these people on staff in case we have this many more people who are going to be incarcerated, it makes it more likely that we're going to have those many more people be incarcerated. And so the same thing is working on for recovery housing and trying to keep enough people on staff because people need to have salaries and raises and dependability and long-term planning and not year-to-year grants. They need to have 5 and 10-year grants to be able to have the right kind of staff, but keeping that fluid enough that you're not spending a lot of dollars to empty beds. So that's what is one of those issues out that if you're looking at starting a place, get with an organization like the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky, look into their trainings for how to cross-train about what the best ways, and they actually have a specific training about those issues, Sonia, about NIMBY, et cetera. And then think about what you're doing in sort of a broad context of what is already out there and how resources can be shifted so that there are the fewest empty beds and the highest quality services available to Kentuckians. That's what, try to think about what your role is in doing that.
Great. I see Anita had a question about the housing choice vouchers. Can you take a moment to talk a little bit more about that voucher and how it applies to our recovery housing? Yes. And obviously how to apply for it?
Yes. So Section 8 is a big, complicated section of federal law that has a lot in it. And so when people say, oh, that's Section 8, they may be correct, and it may have nothing to do with what you're thinking of as Section 8, because there is project-based Section 8. And Anita, I think I know that you're super fluent and familiar in the difference in the vouchers, but there's site-based Section 8, where there is funding that is tied to that site. There is project-based that is tied to, an organization or a company that is not necessarily that physical site. There's ones that are tied to buildings, and then there are the individual housing choice voucher, which again goes with the person, and they are awarded through the Kentucky Housing Corporation in certain parts of Kentucky. There's also vouchers that are awarded through USDA in certain parts of Kentucky that don't go through HUD at all. They're through USDA. Again, this is one of those challenges where if you're in Covington, there is a Covington Section 8 office who awards the housing choice vouchers. If you are in a different county, that same housing choice voucher may go directly through KHC, Kentucky Housing Corporation. If you're in a different county, it may come through USDA, which is why you need to have local knowledge. And I wish that it was far more uniform. So I want a uniform landlord-tenant law and uniform housing subsidies with, I mean, I know that we need to have things different in, like, Louisville is very different from my home county and Floyd County, but there should be the same floor, and there's not, even a little bit. And also, I will echo Adrienne Bush, who says, universal housing towards vouchers fully funded at the federal level would be swell. So if anybody wants to get on the phone and make some phone calls and put that into their regular weekly asks, I hope everyone on this call does a weekly ask. I try to do mine on Monday morning. Sometimes I miss it, but I literally hold up my 5 fingers and then pull them down as I make my phone calls before I start my day or at the end of my day to call my state rep, my state senator, you know, my U.S. rep, and that's 2 U.S. senators. Because if they don't hear from me, they don't know how to represent me. Then representative democracy falls apart. So, and there can be something as easy as none of the counties in Kentucky are ULTA. There are jurisdictions within counties. So, like, for example, Covington has ULTA, but, you know, Erlanger does not. Fort Thomas does not, but Newport does. So you can be on the line between those two and have the same landlord on the same street, but one is in one the property line is there. And so that's how you find out what applies. And there is some energy to try to make it pass countywide. That would be fantastic. If if we can't even get we can't get it statewide, at least get all of Kenton County, all of Campbell County, all of Floyd County, all of Round County, all of Warren County, all of Boone County, Barron County. So those different parts of Kentucky, that's a fine approach too. I have not put personally a lot of energy into that in many years. I did for a while. It was very challenging, but dynamics change all the time. And so what's possible changes all the time. And I was like, Anita had me on that one in there, that Life Learning Center is unrelated to Recovery Kentucky. It's a very different independent program. And yes, I am familiar with Life Learning Center, yes.
I know we've just finished a legislative session, but now's the time to start thinking about the next session. Are there any advocacy issues or legislation that you anticipate coming in the next session that the group should know about, that they should be supporting, or that could be a concern for them?
Well, yes, always, because who sets what those are us. Like, we are the people who will determine what comes before the Kentucky General Assembly by asking for it. So by grassroots advocacy and by people, asking the people that represent them to look out for recovery housing, to look out for the residents of that housing. That's how we get it on the agenda. So I would ask that if it doesn't happen, then that's because we need to keep at it. So, like, it's always out there to come to pass. Now, let's say what we actually faced this last session was a bill to allow landlords to use state resources to punish tenants that made alleged destruction of property beyond normal wear and tear into a crime, so that instead of the landlord as who's chosen to go into business in this area, having to take that cost of doing business to recover their losses, instead they can have the state do that work and try to recover their losses for them through a criminal proceeding, which is a strange outsourcing of private business onto state prosecution in my mind, which I opposed, and members of the Thrive Kentucky Coalition opposed, giving the state that authority to do that on behalf of private businesses. And again, exclusively against more Kentuckians with less power in the situation. So I'm hopeful that we can go back and fix that. I'm hopeful that we can move forward with, how are we going to spend the money coming into Kentucky? There's a lot of money under the American Rescue Plan Act coming into Kentucky to support improving our housing policies. And so there's a lot of opportunity to weigh in there. And I know that our legislature will be weighing in there. So being a part of that conversation, it's even when it's not the session, it's always the session, because there's always what's coming tomorrow, what's coming next week, what's coming next year, and who's having the conversations about it and who's making a fuss about it. But I would say that my sort of last word on the issue is we need to have a basic uniform housing law in Kentucky, and that will take care of a lot of the risks that are out there in recovery housing. Like that's sort of a basic, everybody needs to have home renter protections for both landlords and homeowners and home renters. And that way we can support long-term recovery and help.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions today from the group? Okay. If not, again, I want to encourage everyone to complete the survey. The link was shared in the chat box. A reminder to sign up for our newsletter so we can all stay in touch. And I definitely want to thank Cara, Kentucky Voices for Health, for putting on this webinar for us today. We greatly appreciate it and want to hear from our partners over in Kentucky about other emerging issues that we could consider as we think about how to grow recovery in Kentucky. As a reminder, we will be sending out or making the slide presentation available on our website. We did record it today, and we certainly thank everyone for being here with us.